You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast, the hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com, thechrisvossshow.com. Welcome to the big show, my family and friends. We certainly appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much for tuning in. Without you, where would we be? It'd just be Chris Voss talking into a mic, which is pretty much what it is anyway when you really think about it. But we need the listeners, and we need you, and you're so important. Remember, the Chris Voss Show is a family that loves you, but doesn't judge, at least not as harshly as your mother-in-law. For the show to your family, friends, and relatives, those are the plugs, ladies and gentlemen. YouTube.com/Chris Voss, Goodreads.com/Chris Voss, and a big LinkedIn group, and subscribe to that newsletter, that LinkedIn newsletter. That thing is huge over there. People love that thing. There's a big 130,000 group over there, and we get to talk about all sorts of brilliant stuff. I'm being told we're going to be booking our third billionaire, or he was a billionaire until he recently sold his company. I think that was a valuation, but we're evidently booking him on the show. So the billionaire is just coming. I think we're just going to have a billionaire show from here on out. I don't know. We'll probably run out of episodes at that point. But we have, of course, the most brilliant minds, authors, thinkers on the show, and none of them are me. So that's why we have guests. So we got smart people on. Today we have an amazing guest on the show. He is here to talk to us about his latest book that comes out April 11th, 2023. I think it's about the Styx album in 1976 called Grand Illusion. No, it's not. I'm making that up. His book is actually entitled appropriately Grand Delusion: The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. Stephen Simon is on the show with us today. He's going to be talking about his amazing book and some of the insight, because the one thing you always hear me say on the show, the one thing man can learn from his history is man never learns from his history. So maybe we should stop doing that, because we just go round and round. Stephen Simon served on the National Security Council staff as a senior director for Middle East and North African affairs from 2011 to 2012. He also worked on the NSC staff 1994 to 1999 on counterterrorism and Middle East policy. These assignments followed a 15-year career at the U.S. Department of State, and between government assignments, he was the Hazib Sabid Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Did I get that right? I don't think I did.
Close enough.
Hasib Sabad. In fact, we've had a few people from the CFR on the show. He was an analyst for the RAND Corporation and a deputy director in International Institute for Strategic Studies. He is currently a professor at Colby College, and he is the co-author, among other books, of The Age of Sacred Terror, winner of the Arthur C. Ross Award for the best book in international relations. Welcome to the show, Stephen. How are you?
I'm great. And thank you for bringing me on your show. I really appreciate it.
And it's wonderful to have you. In fact, I think we had the head of the Council on Foreign Relations on the show, brilliant gentleman, and a few others, actually, that have been on the show from there. So we love the insight that you guys bring to the show. Stephen, give us a .com or wherever on the internet you want people to maybe get to know you a little bit better.
You know, I wish I could, but I'm completely out of it. I'm divorced from social media. So, but I do have a Twitter account. Occasionally I do post. It's SNS_1239.
There you go. You know, internet's pretty toxic anyway, right? So.
Yeah, exactly.
It can be toxic, and sometimes it might be better. Like, I have a bad habit of writing long posts on Facebook, and I'm like, I really should put some of this crap into a book. And people are like, maybe you should just shut up. So there's that. So anyway, what motivated you on to write this latest book?
I didn't think that there was anything out there on the topic. There was a really great book by a British professor, Lawrence Friedman, called Choice of Enemies, and that was really the inspiration for it. He just covered a shorter period in U.S. Involvement in the Middle East, but he was really kind of a model and inspiration. And I thought, well, since I've been there as well as studied it as an academic, it's the logical thing to do would be to follow up on his book, and would also be an opportunity for me to come to grips with my career, because, when you're really serving in government, you're not all that reflective. I mean, you don't think so much about what you're doing. You know what you've got to do, and you do it. The president has a vision, whatever it is, for U.S. policy. You're there at the White House. Your job is to make sure that policy, that vision is turned into policy and ultimately into reality if the government is functioning properly. So I wanted to look back on what I'd done over the course of decades and make sense out of it.
Mm-hmm. There you go. That's it. It's an interesting insight that you're giving. So give us a broad overview of the book, a 30,000 view, and then let's get into some of the details.
Yeah, sure. The book really has a couple of themes. One is that U.S. policy since really the end of the Carter administration, but mostly the beginning of the Reagan administration, which is to say 1981, when he was inaugurated, was regulated by big ideas. Every administration came in, it had its big idea. Mm-hmm. But the thing about these big ideas is that they were essentially disconnected from reality in the region. So, you had these administrations come in and they'd believe this or they'd believe that, and then they'd sort of apply these ideas to a region that, wouldn't recognize them, if it bumped into these ideas, in a closet. I mean, these ideas were they were developed and carried through in the absence of any contact with reality. So that was the one thing. The second theme, which is related, is the degree to which each administration was impervious to voices from within the administration saying, something, what you want to do is disconnected from reality. Mm-hmm. And that's the job, generally speaking, of the intelligence community. Mm-hmm. That's their job. They come in and they speak truth to power, and they say, well, you may want to do X, but, that only works in your imagination. It's not going to work when you try to apply it on the ground. Mm-hmm. And what struck me going through the archives and the declassified intelligence, information, of which there's quite a lot available nowadays, was how often the intelligence community called it right, but had no impact on the administration's desire to implement their big idea, whatever the big idea was. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, and this kind of blew my mind, in retrospect. I mean, I came into government at the beginning of the Reagan administration, and I had a certain take on my experience of government back then. And of course, I was steeped in the legend of Reagan. Mm-hmm. And what struck me about the Reagan administration, about not the whole administration, but the White House really, was their conviction that the key partner for the United States in the region was Iran. Iran was going to be the key player, and Iran was the country with which the United States had to forge a strong relationship. That, I was there, and I didn't really have that impression at the time, but the documents, in retrospect, make it clear. Mm-hmm. So those were the main big themes. Large ideas that had nothing to do with reality. The the difficulty that the United States has had over decades in figuring out what to do about Iran, and with Reagan sort of pointing in one direction, but one which was never followed up. And thirdly, that the intelligence community did, by and large, a pretty good job. They did a good job, but nobody listened.
You know, I've always been enthralled with what the U.S. government policy, and what they do. As a very young boy, I tripped across my mother's copy of 1,000 Days, I think by Schlesinger, about the John F. Kennedy administration, and he detailed in there. I might have his name wrong. He detailed in there, what the Kennedy administration went through, a bit of the deception, or what was apparent deception by, I believe, the CIA, in the Bay of Pigs, and how he dealt with that, and of course how he used that data to process and to deal with the crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And ever since then, it's always been really interesting to me. We had an author on yesterday who we talked about Nigeria and the civil war that it went through and the impact on his family. But part of that was the imperialism of the United Kingdom and American stance. And, looking through history of how American presidents and American administrations have tried to put their fingers on the scale, from everything from CIA assassinations to, us mucking up governments, Iran, of course, the Shah of Iran, and how we tried to game our support there, Cuba as well. And it's interesting to me, the process of what goes through that. And so in your book, you cover 40 years of us mucking about. I'm going to use the word mucking about, with trying to make that work. And one thing that's always interesting to me is, as you mentioned, we have the huge establishment of these U.S. ambassadors. We've had on the show, we've had people that have worked in the government that they have a very long, broad policy because they're there. And these presidents' administrations sometimes come in for 4 or 8 years. And even the intelligence community knows that, hey, these guys are just the show of the week, if you will. And they come in and one person does another and another does another. And how many presidents do you outline and go through the process in the book and kind of analyze our American ambition, as you say, in the Middle East?
Well, I start with Jimmy Carter, the end of his administration, and then Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and of course Joe Biden. So quite a big run of different administrations.
Yeah, and is what do you feel? I mean, this is kind of a big giant question. It might be more complex than the simple answer, but is part of our problem in our American sort of ambition is that asshole Americanist sort of ideal that we are that we're the best thinkers of whatever, like I mentioned, the John F. Kennedy administration, it brought the college people in, and the people were trying to manage a war from some sort of college thing that you could, somehow there was some sort of logical business decisions you can make in a war that would make some sort of edge or difference. And I think it backfired is the summation. Why do we have this grand delusion? Because you've titled the book that. What does that refer to?
Yeah. So it stems from a couple of things. One is that in the aftermath of World War II, the United States had what one scholar called a preponderance of power. Okay. The United States was just so powerful relative to all other countries. Just name them, clump them together. It just, nobody separately or in combination was remotely as powerful, as the United States. And, the generation that grew up in that era, let's say the boomers, they absorbed this sense that the United States had a preponderance of power and could do whatever it wanted, and there wasn't anyone who could seriously challenge it.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing was Vietnam, because Vietnam appeared to challenge this view that the United States did have a preponderance of power.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. fought that war, from the early 60s through the early 1970s. We suffered almost 60,000 KIA, killed in action.
Mm-hmm.
We bombed, North Vietnam to a fairly well. We probably killed 1 million North Vietnamese. And yet we lost. We left Vietnam with our tail between our legs. So, the generation that my book talks about tries to reconcile these two facts: the preponderance of power that they were led to believe the United States possessed on the one hand, and this defeat that they suffered in Vietnam on the other, which was a traumatizing event in American history.
Yeah.
So they tried to reconcile these two ideas, and the way they did it was by pursuing two goals. The one was to erase the memory and the shame of Vietnam and show that the United States could be a power overseas and truly reflect its ability to create reality,
mm-hmm.
despite the disappointing aberration of Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
that they could do it. And this was a driving motivation for this generation, and it led to a number of wars in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
But really before Reagan, and especially during Vietnam, the United States didn't want to do anything in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
The British were still a power in the Middle East, and they could sort of deal with security problems. They didn't really have to worry about access to oil because, the British were in the Persian Gulf, and they would block the Soviets from somehow materializing in the Middle East and stealing our oil. Mm-hmm. The United States was so averse to action in the Middle East during this period that even in the June 1967 war, when all these Arab countries ganged up on Israel and Israel preempted in a devastating attack that essentially reshaped that part of the Middle East, the Johnson administration, the Lyndon Johnson administration, had a chance to intervene and stop the war from even starting.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't really want to do it because they weren't in the habit of intervening in the Middle East, and they had other more important things to do in their view, which, among other things, was fighting this war in Vietnam. So, the United States they didn't think in terms of intervention, but all that changed with the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, and then the accession of the Reagan administration.
Mm-hmm.
And almost just as soon as they came into office, the Reagan administration launched a U.S. incursion into Lebanon, which turned out, disastrously.
Mm-hmm.
But as disastrously as that intervention played out, it didn't seem to contradict, in the minds of this new generation of policymakers, the conviction that the United States could do whatever it wanted in the Middle East. So anyway, I think that's where it really comes from.
There you go. And so you walk through Reagan and all the different presidents since that have tried to, been the people that, hey, we're going to bring peace to the Middle East. I mean, I've been hearing that for 40 years, and it's kind of become almost slapstick or comedic, because you're like, oh yeah, you're going to solve the Middle East problem. Up until Donald Trump and other places, you saw Bill Clinton had that famous Israeli-Palestinian moment on the lawn where they got everybody to shake hands with everybody. And it's really interesting how we just keep going back to that. Is the large part of your book cover, George W. Bush, the incursion into taking Iraq in a bit of war of, some people call us being imperialistic when we do that, or empire building. I know in the it seems to me, and I can't remember the names, but there were certain people that traced through a lot of these administrations, especially the Republican ones, that had. I know during the George Bush administration, the W. Bush administration, I believe there was actually a document of empire building, I think it was called, and I believe some of the specters of those people behind the document, Rumsfeld and other people, and I'm thinking of another name. They have gone through many of these administrations. You look at who's the gentleman with the mustache. In fact, we famously joked with Dr. Richard Voss, who came on the show, about the mustache, and he was actually the proponent between, he always wants to go to war with Iran. Was there truth to some of these documents and some of these proponents that went through administration that consulted with the presidents that constantly have this attachment or issue with trying to empire build in the Middle East and bring sort of an American imperialism to it?
Yeah. So, imperialism is a loaded word. So I just avoid it because it gets people's hackles up, one way or another. So, there's this debate over, so what's actually imperialism? I don't know. Those are deep waters. No reason for us to wade in there. But for sure, there were two U.S. interests in the Middle East that drove American involvement, certainly in the years from 1980 virtually to the present. And the two interests were oil. Okay, everybody kind of knows that, but you really got to stop and think about it. I mean, when the U.S. Declared its interest in Persian Gulf oil, it really needed that oil, not for itself, not for the United States, but it needed it for the Europeans who were seeking to rebuild after World War II. And the idea was, well, if the Europeans didn't have plenty of cheap oil and a reliable supply of it to rebuild, then Western Europe would fall victim to communism. So, the importance of Persian Gulf oil was that it underpinned the Western position in the Cold War. And so that was existential. People thought that was just, incredibly important. It didn't get more urgent than that. And then the other interest was Israel. Israel was established in 1948. In the wake of World War II and these horrible, the horrible Holocaust and the attempt by the Germans to erase the Jewish people in Europe, there were a lot of, Jews who managed to escape Europe, or who, Hitler didn't get a chance to kill before Germany lost the war. They needed a place to go, and frankly, neither the United States nor Britain wanted to let them into their respective countries. So it made sense to send them to Palestine, which is where the Jewish survivors seemed to want to go. And then it became a responsibility for the United States to safeguard this new state and see that it survived against the odds in a very hostile region. So two big interests. These were strongly held interest. In the case of Israel, it was supported by a strong domestic constituency. So it was a domestic political issue as much as it was a foreign policy issue.
Mm-hmm.
On the oil side of things, it was a profound economic concern. So even after the Soviet venture in the Middle East dissolved, and there was no longer any conceivable threat to oil in Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates.
Mm-hmm.
Oil was still really important because it meant that the price of oil meant the difference between a recession and a thriving economy.
Mm-hmm.
So it was hugely important. And because there was so much money involved, these relationships with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and other oil producers threw off a lot of cash.
Yeah.
So you got everybody from members of Congress to lobbyists to big donors to political candidates in the United States. They all thrived on the cash that the U.S.-Saudi relationship just sort of tossed off in great quantities. And that solidified, this perception in Washington that Saudi Arabia was just really important to U.S. interests. So you had those two things, driving U.S. intervention. Now, was this imperialism? Was it not imperialism? Who knows?
Empire
but it was,
building.
But it was there. Maybe there was a bit of that actually, and the United States wound up acting as though it were an empire.
Mm-hmm.
By intervening militarily in very significant ways, one in 1991 and the other in 2003. And those interventions were both launched by somebody named Bush. So, and they were both justified by grand ideas,
mm-hmm.
okay, by this big idea that the administration carried around in front of them and wherever they went. In the way the George W. Bush administration expressed it, it was the New World Order.
Mm-hmm.
And in the New World Order, people played by the rules. Bad countries didn't invade nice countries. Big countries didn't exploit small countries. In other words, all the things the United States actually did over the years. In the New World Order, that would not happen. And the United States was going to be the guarantor of this New World Order. The way that was reframed under Bush in 2003 was, well, the United States was acting on behalf of the international community, and the United States was seeking to make a gift of democracy to the Arabs in the region who were thirsting for it. And if the United States had to kill 100,000 Arabs, to make this work, well, surely if you asked all those Arabs, assuming you could communicate with them in the next world, they would tell you, hey, I was glad to give my life, so that there could be democracy in Iraq. But the wars were justified by these grand themes, and they were grand themes that didn't really relate very much to realities in the region. And the two wars are connected because, the first war, which was launched to get Iraq out of Kuwait. Iraq had invaded Kuwait, this small country just south of it, to steal Kuwait's oil for a lot of reasons. Anyway, they felt they were entitled to it, so they just wanted to go and take it. The United States launched a war to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait, but they didn't finish the job.
Yeah.
And they left Saddam Hussein, who ran Iraq, with a huge army.
Mm-hmm.
And that created problems because the United States wanted Iraq to comply with various rules and regulations, after that war. But there were the kinds of rules and regulations that you could only enforce if you occupied a country and had a big army there. Mm-hmm. But we weren't occupying it, and we didn't have a big army there. So the situation went unresolved until Bush's son became president, and deranged by 9/11, decided to take it out on Iraq. But Iraq would not have been in the crosshairs in the second Bush administration if it hadn't have been attacked by a previous Bush administration.
There you go. And you talk about that in the book, about how George W. Bush has stated repeatedly that he was not going to invade Iraq, but they'd already prepared for war. In fact, there's the famous famous thing where Colin Powell goes before the UN committee and claims that they do have proof of WMDs and they're just faking it. I don't know if he was aware of that at the time, or if he believed whatever sort of intelligence he was fed. Yeah, this kind of arrogance that we have as Americans, and I believe did some of that doctrine that you're talking about kind of give us this sort of attitude that we were the police state to the world, that was our job to police and enforce, world order, as it were?
Well, yeah. And the United States had two powerful weapons, it believed, to control things. The one was this enormous military establishment. I mean, truly colossal. And the other was a reserve currency, the dollar. The global economy was structured around the dollar. If you weren't working in dollars, well, that was too bad, because you couldn't do any serious transactions. And if you were working in dollars, all those transactions ran through the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. So between control of a global currency and a preponderance of military power, the United States had tremendous tools, but at the end of the day, they proved to be a delusion.
Yeah.
Because the wars that the United States fought in the Middle East were lost, and its control, over currency, especially in the oil trade, was never sufficient to force Iran to sign an agreement on nuclear weapons that it didn't want to sign. So, you've got these fantastic capabilities, which seem to be the biggest ever in the history of recorded time. But you still couldn't get your way.
Yeah. And let me ask you this, because this is important. I don't know if you talk about it in the book, but there's been a lot of discussion that part of the reason for the Iraq War was Saddam threatened to, or was taking his oil off of the dollar. And you mentioned before, that's a big power for us. That's kind of a topic that's come up recently, because right now, once again, and I believe China and Russia have been at this for years, but China, Russia, Iran, and are trying to establish a new denomination that can take, can replace the dollar as the thing that everything is bought and traded in the world, especially oil. Is there any truth to that with the Iraqi war and the George Bush administration, that one of the big pushes for, or maybe it was the original George Bush's administration, that the threat that Saddam was going to take his oil off of the dollar, that was one of the reasons we invaded?
That that might be true. I'm not familiar with it. But it was the era in which the U.S. weaponized the dollar. And people warned at the time that, there's a reason the dollar is a reserve currency. And the one is that, well, there's nobody who doubts the staying power of the United States. and its political institutions. So already that confers on the dollar, a huge credibility.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is that, the dollar is just that. It's a currency that enables commerce and transactions to proceed, and the United States understands that the desirability of the dollar is not just owing to the stability of the United States, but it owes to the understanding of the United States that you don't mess with currency. And it's this latter consideration that's become really problematic, for the dollar, and that's given rise to this Russian, Chinese, Iranian, cabal to try and establish their own currencies, whether it's the renminbi, the Chinese unit of currency, is looking pretty good in this respect now, because when people want to do transactions, they don't have to worry that suddenly their dollar is going to become toxic.
Yeah.
Either because they're doing business with a country or an individual that's been sanctioned by the United States, or you yourself have been sanctioned by the United States. So, your currency essentially becomes worthless for serious transactions.
And we've seen that tool used as a weapon now in modern warfare, technically through banking, with the war in the Ukraine with Russia, and how they've tried to isolate its ability to trade and do money. What do you hope people come away from in reading your book? Because it's quite the book, and you're covering a lot of ground. What do you hope people come away from in the book and maybe discover?
Okay, I suppose that's the big question, Chris. So several things. The first is that, administration after administration is, besotted with, various delusions that drive policy. And, a lot of these delusions are deluded precisely because they don't have much connection to realities on the ground, but they're just linked to how policymakers think about what the world should be like. Mm-hmm. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but if you lose sight of what the world is like, then you've got a problem. And that's been a problem for the United States. In the entire period, just about the entire period that the book covers, and that in entertaining and pursuing policies based on these delusions, successive administrations have been quite impervious to evidence to the contrary that's presented to policymakers from within each administration. So it's not necessarily external criticism, but there are those within each administration whose job it is to deal in a serious and undiluted way with reality. It's their job, to do that and present that to policymakers. Those people are more often ignored than not. The second is that we have this terrible relationship with Iran. And it's been a problem for the United States since, the moment the book begins. Mm-hmm. And you had, in fact, the Reagan administration, and this has been in the news just recently, by the way, the Reagan administration started out, even before the election, by colluding with the Iranians to hold on to American hostages until Reagan was elected and inaugurated, as a way to jam his opponent's campaign, Jimmy Carter's campaign. And then after that, Reagan continued to sell weapons to Iran. And then in the end of his first term, the beginning of his second term, he entered into a secret deal with the Iranians to supply the Iranians with weapons. And he didn't do that accidentally. And we know from documents that are available for scholars and others to see that members of the administration argued forcefully that if you look at Iran, the size of their population, the quality of its education, the fact that, among other things, it's not Arab, and so forth. It was the logical ally for the United States.
Wow.
And ever since then, in each administration, the president either comes in wanting to slap the Iranians around, and then leaves office wanting to hug them, or the president comes in wanting to hug Iran and leaves office, just wanting to kick them in the shins. Mm-hmm. So that's been a very vexing thing, and it's still very vexing now. So that's another theme. The United States has never figured out how to deal with Iran. And third is this infatuation with military force. Mm-hmm. That seems to be diminishing right now, at least with respect to the Middle East. But the infatuation with military force was really something, certainly in my time in government, and the history of the period just shows it. And military doctrines like shock and awe could intoxicate policymakers and cause them to think that the United States could do like amazing things and automatically succeed. Lastly, I'd say, going back to the two main drivers for U.S. policy in the period covered by the book, Israel and oil, basically. The United States, I think what the book tries to show is that the United States has accomplished its objectives with respect to Israel mm-hmm. and Saudi Arabia. Israel is a country whose existence no one in their right mind would challenge. Mm-hmm. Right now, militarily, it's the strongest country, in the Middle East, and it's nuclear armed. Mm-hmm. It's not the vulnerable country it was after World War II that the United States had to protect. And one can see how Israel, feeling secure and wealthy at this stage, feels free to diss the United States, because Israel doesn't need the United States anymore, or at least in their perception. They don't need the United States anymore. So they're happier, dealing with the United States closely when there's a Republican administration, because the values coincide. But otherwise, the United States, they could take it or leave it. Mm-hmm. Saudi Arabia is a country with no natural predators. It's incredibly rich, and it's now carving out its own path. Mm-hmm. Seeking stronger relationships with countries that are adversaries of the United States.
Yeah.
10 years ago, that would have been completely unthinkable. Mm-hmm. But they wouldn't be in a position to do that had the United States not succeeded in incubating Saudi Arabia and keeping it safe during the years when it was arguably vulnerable. And I think, this is like the empty nest syndrome, Chris.
Yeah.
That the chicks have fledged, and the United States needs to accept the fact, that, Israel and Saudi Arabia are not, the little kids who are hanging around the wrong crowd in a schoolyard and need to be controlled or disciplined, but they are they're just following their own star now. So that's what you get for succeeding.
It's interesting, the arrogance of our American foreign policy, and like I said, the first book I ever read was not the first book I ever read, but the first real sort of administrative policy book that I read was 1,000 Days, and it was interesting to me to see, how a president deals with the intelligence community. At that time, the CIA doing all sorts of stuff that the CIA does, and it was interesting to me, the play of how, as a country, we've tried to put our thumb on so many different scales, and we've tried to put, in this sort of incitement of, well, democracy, the shining beacon on the hill, which is a favorite phrase among the Reagan administration, and the trying to put our thumbs on the scales. And you see the sort of crises that we created in Cuba, in South America. There was the famous massacre of the administration funneling guns and stuff, in the Reagan administration funneling guns into, was it Ecuador? But there was all sorts of problems in the South, in the South America that we did there, genocide in Guatemala, all sorts of different things that we were trying to muck about with our thing. Even when you look at Saddam Hussein, I mean, we built and funded that guy, and then we get bit in the butt. Same thing with what you mentioned with Saudi Arabia. Now, evidently, they're one of the people who it's speculated, may be involved in this new scheme to try and overthrow the dollar as the predominant use of purchasing power in oil in the world. All the different things that we've done that just have, we've tried to do this sort of idealistic sort of pledge that, the Iraqis will greet us as liberators. And no one seemed to understand in the W. Bush administration that Saddam Hussein was the only thing keeping, the factions of Iraq from going at each other and creating a whole civil war. And it's always been interesting to me how, we seem to almost create these problems over these years by mucking about and trying to, be the smart guy in the room. And we actually end up causing problems, or like 9/11, getting attacked and destroyed, and then drawn into an even bigger conflict that, when you look at how we pulled out of Afghanistan recently, we had soldiers that wrote books on the war that were sitting there going, what the hell did we do all that for? Why did we lose our people? Why did I fight this war for, this ugly ending that was almost like Saigon, that helicopter out of Saigon. So it's interesting. And I think it's important that books like yours highlight this so that we kind of have an understanding, and maybe we come out of the atmosphere with this, this asshole American deal that somehow we're the brilliant people in the room with the answers to everything. Or maybe we are, I don't know.
Well, we certainly have the grand delusions.
There you go. And hence the title of the book. Anything more you want to tease on the book before we go? Because we could probably spend another 40 years talking about these concepts.
I think, Chris, we hit the high points. I would just add that it looked as though in the Obama's second term and onward, the fever had broken. Mm-hmm. I mean, Obama came into office also with a grand delusion, and it was not unlike the preceding grand delusions of previous administrations. This one was that the United States could also impose democracy on the Middle East, because we had the Arab Spring. You recall that was during Obama's first term, and there was turbulence especially in Tunisia, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and Bahrain, and so forth. All these smaller countries, and the United States intervened in Libya in a fairly big way, and that turned into what Obama ultimately called a shit show. It was, Obama kind of looked at what happened in Libya and sort of said, "Well, we're not doing that again. We're not doing that again."
And then you look at the result of that.
You look
with Syria.
Obama at first was not inclined to get involved in Syria. And there's still this perception out there that the United States remained uninvolved, but he was convinced by David Petraeus in the short time that Petraeus was heading the CIA during Obama's first term to launch a major effort to arm and train the so-called moderate opposition to the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, and that turned out to be one of the largest such operations that the United States had launched ever. As we can see by looking at the newspaper every day, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Assad is still there. And the United States is reduced to 900 men and women in uniform in eastern Syria, basically protecting the Kurds and the oil wells there, and that's sort of about it. But I doubt that Obama, if you asked him today, was that a good idea? To launch that huge arm and train effort in Syria, and he'd probably say, "Nah, not really." That what it did was drag out a bloody civil war in ways that certainly didn't further U.S. interest, but added, to the vast toll of the war that has been paid by the Syrian people. Yeah. But anyway, if you look at Obama's second term, he's got one he's got one signature policy program in the Middle East, and that's bringing Iran to the table to get control of its nuclear program. And he succeeded in doing that. And many people doubted that he could, but he did, and it was a good agreement. And the Iranians were abiding by it until Donald Trump walked away from it.
Yeah.
So, but that gets us to Donald Trump, who was mostly in non-intervention mode. And now, we look at Joe Biden and we see more or less the same reluctance to get involved in the Middle East. And this was before Ukraine. Okay. And now with the Ukraine thing going on and tensions with China, you could really see why the administration would be distracted from the Middle East. But even before those huge developments unfolded, Biden was pretty reluctant, to put skin in any Middle Eastern game. So anyway, what I'm saying here really is that perhaps the fever has broken, and this age of intervention, the age of grand delusion, is coming to an end.
Yeah. And
that would be a good thing.
Yeah, the interest to me too is it, and like I say, from the moment I read 1,000 Days, seeing the chessboard of how things play out. Like, for example, one of the things that constrained Obama was a public perception that we're tired of wars, we're tired of this Iraq thing, and we're just over it. Stop it. Quit getting into new things. And so he had that pressure on him. But then you see, we just had an author on earlier this week that wrote about the migrant crisis in 2015. You see how that shaped geopolitical nations that dealt with all these immigrants that came out of Syria and moved the country or countries, especially in Europe and here in America, very dangerously close to fascism and authoritarianism and very right-wingish sort of push because of this, the racism of immigration and other things in dealing with that. And we do this huge curve and arc as a country politically to where, we have more right-wing figures getting elected, and kind of the rise of authoritarian between Brazil, Europe, and all these sort of things where now, we're dealing with the affront of fascism. And so it's interesting to me how all of the public policy or the foreign policy that we do in America has these whole sort of chessboard sort of come arounds. And so that's why I think it's important people read your book and understand how, all these things affect. And I read one time, or I think someone said one time, that one of the challenges with U.S. administrations is when they come in, there's kind of this, they feel that they have a mandate, that they've been ordained by the voters to have this mandate and that they are now the smartest kids in the room and they're going to fix it all. And they very quickly come slamming against reality. I don't know if you find that's a true analogy, but I heard someone say it once.
It's very true. And I've been through a number of these transitions, and both as a civil servant, a career government person, and also a political appointee. And, of course, the new administration comes in and they do think they know better than the outgoing administration, and that one of the things they need to do is clean up the mess that's been created by the guys and gals who are on their way out. I think that's a natural inclination, and it's true of Republicans and Democrats. It just seems to be baked into the pie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there you go. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. And I love these discussions, and they're insightful. And hopefully, I say this continuously as a quote of mine. The one thing man can learn from his history is man never learns from his history. And thereby we go round and round. So it's important that we learn from our history and that we kind of, try and do better, whatever that means. So there you go. Give us your .coms, or I think it was a Twitter handle that you use that maybe people can go check you out on the interwebs.
You bet.
Go ahead.
Yep. SNS_1239.
There you
on
go.
Twitter.
There you go. And order up the book, folks, wherever fine books are sold. Learn about your history, because it's important, of course, as a voting bloc, as people who elect the administrations and have an influence public perception and public desires for what goes on in the Middle East. This is stuff we need to know and understand, because we're the ones who ultimately vote to put these people in office. Order up the book wherever fine books are sold. The Grand Delusion. I'm sorry, let me recut that. Grand Delusion: The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East by Stephen Simon. Available April 11th, 2023. Thanks so much for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, and all the other places you can find on the interwebs. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe. And we'll see you guys next time.